Huh. Good morning. Thank you. That's exactly the setup we wanted. Everybody on this panel has at one point in their career worked through the money-losing, bleeding edge of sustainability in real estate and is on the other side of that, or theoretically we're on the other side of that now, and so we're going to talk through all of those points. What I would also say that makes it special to be here today is that I've worked on this topic and taught and studied at a number of institutions across the country, including teaching at several Ivy League institutions. And when I'm at those institutions, it is almost exclusively academics talking to academics. And the frustration is the lack of industry invited into the room. So being asked to be here by Sam today, and what I think you're producing in New York City by bringing all sides to the table, is fundamental to moving the ball forward, whether it's for capital or for the cause of sustainability. I really thank you for having us today for that reason. So I'm going to try and save you time on me, and it all comes down to how you answer two questions. The first is, raise your hands if you think you understand what mass timber is. Okay, pretty good. And how many people are comfortable with the term embodied carbon? Okay, so I think we cut 2 minutes right there. Thank you. For those of you who aren't comfortable with the term embodied carbon, don't worry, neither is the Department of Energy. In their recently released booklet on how to define a net zero building, they talk only about operational carbon. Operational carbon is not the whole solution. It is part of one, and I'm sure many of our wonderful speakers are going to tackle that today. But 42% of global emissions come from the built environment. Of that, only 28% annually come from operational carbon. So the majority of the carbon stack are in the issues we're going to address first off today. So mass timber, quickly, thank you for your education coming to the panel, much appreciated. Going from how we used to build, a country built on the back of wood, to how we have industrialized it now. Factories doing building length, 50-foot, 80-foot panels that click together like Legos to create building systems. Sorry, figuring this out. Quickly, mass timber is a multiplicity of building types designed for strength, fire, resistance, and sustainability. So they will not create another Chicago fire or anything of that nature. The one most people are familiar with is cross-laminated timber in the bottom left corner, which is what allows us to build tall and build wide spans competitive with steel. So where are we in North America on this? We are seeing Microsoft, Google, the Walmart headquarters, which we have experience on the panel today, build corporate headquarters. We're seeing 25-story buildings in America out of this. We're seeing 36-story buildings in Vancouver and Canada out of this. We're seeing industrialized factories. We're seeing hotels. We're seeing 2 to 3-story additions in urban centers. So we have got to the point where we're seeing a lot of variety of infrastructure and real estate product. So why, per the title of the talk, is the panel, is this a timber future? Well, as brought up at the beginning, with rising costs, labor shortages, and supply chain disruptions making everything you all are trying to do and we are trying to do unpredictable, mass timber projects are delivering across the country at 15 to 25% schedule improvements over typical concrete and steel buildings. We're seeing them built with up to 40% less labor on site. So we're talking about taking the two biggest issues off the table. You can find similar markers in other prefabricated systems, but you can't find any of them aligning with the sustainability goals that are offered by building in timber. So to just qualify those goals, as I said earlier, 48% annual, 28% of which is the building operation. So the rest of embodied carbon means everything you're trucking, everything you're extracting for, so aggregate for concrete, smelting for steel, all of that energy output is calculated in the footprint of your building. It's a little, if you focus on operational carbon, it's a little like changing the oil in a car that has no wheels. It doesn't matter if you're not running the thing yet, or how fast or how slow you run the thing. If we want to talk about the impact on the built environment, we want to go beyond carbon neutrality and go into reverse, where we're using our buildings as carbon sinks, which is the promise of mass timber, where trees are raised in the forest. We incentivize harvesting through the higher pricing and yields you get for planting more trees around the planet, and then locking that carbon storage into your building, therefore doubling the lifespan and activating it as storage. Then there's a whole world you can go into about how flexible these buildings are for reuse as certain paradigms change, as office falls out, as residential falls in. The flexibility of the building type and the ease with which you can saw and screw them back together in different ways far surpasses anything we typically build with now. So for us on the panel, I think you're looking at the lower left-hand side back to the early aughts of where we were starting on our journey around mass timber. Now, since 2019, you can see the hockey stick-like progression of projects across North America. So blue is everything being planned right now. Green are finished or nearly finished projects. And the sectors are really diverse, all the way down to warehouses and data centers. So we're not just talking residential and commercial type buildings. Now take that same graph and overlay it here against European production and capacity. What we would note is really exciting is that the trends are following the same direction, but Europe is 10 years ahead of us. There's a number of reasons we'll get into this with our panel, but the fun part as I look at this is that you can look at this graph and literally predict the future of real estate, and you can predict it for nothing more than the cost of a plane flight to Germany. So why is Europe ahead? They're ahead because they've already put carbon pricing and regulatory incentives into their building structures. If you want to build a new public building in France in the next 10 years, you have to have 50% plant-based materials in your building. Okay, so we're not there yet, and the regulatory systems right now don't look so favorable. But we already have things happening. In Vancouver and here with Local Law 97, we're starting to track out a map for penalizing carbon emissions and carbon footprint in our buildings. And there's a lot of other things coming online, not just in New York City. Also, the code adoption. We've started to pick up a lot more height and a lot more breadth in what we allow to be built in the United States and where we allow it to be built. It's quickly changing. For instance, we have two large 300,000 square foot projects, towers going up in New Haven very easily just up the road, but I can't build them yet in New York City. So it's not just California, New York, it's New York, New Jersey, and New York is still the toughest, admittedly, but it got a lot better in 2023, where we started to allow 6 stories, 85 feet of height in all timber in New York. So to put that in perspective, 95% of New York City, 1 million plus buildings are 85 feet or less. So if you're looking for an opportunity market, you're talking about the majority of what gets built in New York you can do in timber. So our group today, our group today has, as I said, a wide variety of experience. Pete Colbelt here, the head of, director of sustainability and mass timber solutions at Structure Tone organization, has led over 1.5 million square feet of timber project in the United States, including at the University of Arkansas, Bentonville, and a new headquarters for Walmart. Carrie Denning-Jackson, next down, has extensive experience beginning with that bleeding edge, participating in the conceptual development of the redevelopment of the Toronto waterfront in all timber for Sidewalk Labs. And now at Jamestown, as the Director of Sustainability and Technology, is familiar with all of their efforts on the development for more standard buildings, lease, retail places, big box stores, so a wide variety of product, but also mass timber. Emily Moreau at the end is on the other side. She started her career in product development in tech, including stops at Apple, then came through to a company that some of you are probably familiar with called Katerra, saw their jersey, journey and is now the CEO of Juno, which is prefabricated housing developments. As your partner, if you're the developer, can prefabricate and erect your building for you from a kit of parts. So we have a lot of different perspectives on how timber comes to the marketplace. I'd like to wrap that up by saying, for all these reasons you have on the left, including fire safety, seismic resilience, reduced MEP investment, faster delivery, and the sustainability portion at the top, there's a great last piece to this to unlock, which we'll also try to get to on the panel, which is these buildings just lease faster. They lease faster, they sell faster, both here and in Europe. They're differentiators in the marketplace because who doesn't want to live in a biophilic, organic environment over a drywall and static environment? And we see that in the returns on the marketplace. And then for more value to you, I think today we'll talk about the challenges. The insurance market, the supply chain, cost estimating, and some of those regulatory hurdles that I got into. So here's our panel, and we'll just jump into it. So I'd like to go down the line, Pete, trying to just piggyback on what we just went through to ask you, in your experience, how have you seen the key economic drivers shift to make mass timber more viable for developers and investors today?
Yeah, so that's one of our themes. I'm going to skip this. Can you all hear me? I've never been accused of being a low talker. This thing makes me anxious. By the way, jeans, Michael, right here. I see stretch pants at the fancy table. Fine. But to your point, profit. It's our job, specifically my job, to not just talk about sustainability and innovation, but craft and narrate the process towards making a compelling business case for the investor group, the ownership group, the investor group, and then alleviating apprehension on the insurance side. So that was a really perfect, and we didn't rehearse this, kickoff, because I can go to university campuses and evangelize about sustainability and preach to the choir all day long, and carbon and all the themes that Aaron knocked out. But at the end of the day, we have to make a compelling business case. Now, universities are a bit of an anomaly. They can amortize cost out over longer periods. The facilities guys are owner-operators. That's a really important segment. If it's not a developer-driven and it's an owner-operator, many of the primary and secondary attributes of the system can be brought to bear to make a more holistic business case. And when you can crack a facilities guy at a tier 1 university to get on your team and be a champion of your cause, that's a real bellwether for for the market. You want me to touch on Europe a little bit, or let them?
We'll get back to Europe. Emily, the same question about what your key cost drivers, maybe starting with some of the projects at Katerra, but really focused on how Juno sees the marketplace today.
Yeah, to quickly speak to the Katerra experience, I think what Katerra really did for mass timber construction, for prefabrication in general, and I'll start by saying one of the reasons that I really like mass timber is that it is sort of a Trojan horse into prefabrication that also has the sustainability element, right? If you can deliver a mass timber building, you can deliver a prefabricated building. And I think both of those elements are really important to get, for the sustainability angle. So what I think Katerra did for prefabrication and for mass timber generally was put the term on the map. They, with $4 billion from SoftBank behind them, they went out big with a vertically integrated kit of parts-based model for multifamily construction, and then invested a ton of that money, $200 million of it, I believe, in a very large mass timber factory, state-of-the-art, up in Spokane, Washington, that's now run by Mercer. So I think that was really helpful for getting these concepts and getting people familiar and getting with it, getting on everybody's radar. They didn't do us any favors. The company didn't do us any favors when they went under in 2021. But I think it was really helpful for just for getting the terms on the map. I think when people talk about mass timber, the conversations really has often been about sustainability. But to Michael's point, I think the reason that you build a mass timber building is because if executed correctly, and that part's important, it has the potential to make you more money. I think that comes in 3 key places. On the revenue side, right? You're underwriting yield on cost and IRR. These buildings rent for more, they lease up faster and they get into the market faster, right? So you're pulling on the levers of yield and then time to market. Efficiency. I think if executed correctly, there's a lot of contingency in the construction budget. And by nature of being a prefabricated building, you have to do a lot of the work up front to deliver it, right? So you're bringing your teams on board earlier, you're planning, you're taking your design to a greater level of detail. And if you're doing all that the way you should be doing that, you will use less of your construction contingency and less of your development contingency, particularly over time as people get better and better and the ecosystem gets better at delivering these buildings. And then the last is speed. People talk a lot about speed when it comes to mass timber construction because of the panelized nature of it. But I think, I think that's part of it. And I think it's important. I think for us, for Juneau, it wasn't just about the mass timber structural system going up quickly, but it's what else can you prefabricate? Because it doesn't do you a lot of good if your structure goes up quickly, if then you have to turn around and sit and wait on your facade system.
So, Carrie, similar, you have I find your stories fascinating because you, starting with the Toronto project at Sidewalk, you tried to create the market almost before it was there. And now you're a benefit at Jamestown of rethinking very standard product in many ways through the new construction lens. Maybe you could walk us through that.
Yeah, I can share a little bit about Sidewalk, which is a similar story. I mean, we were in it, it was Google's project to create the most innovative city ever, and it failed for numerous reasons. But we were doing a similar thing, but we went in it saying it was a sustainability thing. It was an innovation thing. So much of what we were doing, frankly, didn't pencil, and that was part of the project and part of the reason it failed. But we wanted to do what was the most innovative building structure at the time. And we went at it, and similarly, I think we helped put it on the map and make it a thing, but we worked very deeply with the Toronto Fire Department. We actually brought them to a burn test in Texas to prove the 2-hour burn, that it was still structurally sound. We did a lot around how you would have less trucks going down Toronto's main highway, which is full of traffic. And we did this cool map that showed if a conventional build, how backed up the trucks would be up the road, and it went all the way to the airport. So we went in it really for that reason. I think with 619 Ponce in Atlanta, it's a mass timber building we built. Not as many stories. I think it's something like 5 or 6 stories. But it's a similar thing where it was motivated by finances, but also by Jamestown happens to own timber in addition to real estate. And our MD for timber was just dogged about mass timber to the point where our president was like, if you keep talking about this, I will fire you. And I don't know if that's real or not, who knows, but he was just really, really adamant about it. And I don't want to share too much in this because I know there'll be a future question, but the lease up was real. It happened really, really fast. Pottery Barn was like, I need to be in this space. Despite their other umbrella, they're all under the same umbrella with West Elm, and West Elm was located at Ponce. So they were like, we don't care if it's going to cannibalize. We need to be in this space. Similarly, another office tenant, Sage, was like, we need to be in this space. So we were able to lease up really fast. And there's a couple other cool benefits to it, but I'll share those later. Well, I don't want to ruin it all.
No, the next question is about speed. So that's kind of perfect. So you keep going.
Yeah, it was extremely fast. Saved 2/3 of the time of a conventional build. And the other part that's just absolutely blew my mind, like this was an 117,000 square foot building. Across the street, we were doing 2 other steel and concrete buildings, a residential and a hospitality unit. And one of the buildings alone had 150 people on site. Just guess how many people were on site for the mass timber. I'm just totally curious what you guys think. Lower.
20.
Lower.
12.
Lower. There were 6 people on site and 2 foremen. It was insane. And so you're able to really watch the work. Like mistakes really come up. Like you can see them real. It's not, and no one can slack because there's 6 people on site. So it's remarkable. It saves a ton of money. So that's my one cool, amazing tidbit for this.
So Pete, knowing that the technology changed a few times on the Arkansas projects. Can you walk us through that arc?
Yeah.
What that tells us about speed as well as supply chain management?
Yeah, so we did a couple projects at the University of Arkansas which spawned interest from the Walton family office up the street in Bentonville. We were down in Fayetteville. And I got an opportunity to help the family leadership reimagine a brand new 350-acre campus in a much more sustainable manner than they were currently contemplating. And that, interestingly enough, is coming from the third generation Waltons, the kids, who were really influencing leadership to change the whole paradigm and really do a holistic life cycle assessment of a new campus. And so the Massey campus was an enormous opportunity across 15 buildings to displace concrete and steel. Now, that was very ambitious. We decided ultimately to bring a factory to the state. I come from a forestry background. For me, it all starts with the wood basket and understanding tree to key. And I have a fun little soundbite that I developed at the forestry school that Arkansas has 19 million acres of trees that grow 71 tons of wood fiber every 60 seconds. So in the time we've been talking, we've grown hundreds of tons of fiber. On one of those office buildings, as one example, we could regrow that building in 2 hours and 30 minutes just in that wood basket in the state. So for those trying to learn about sustainability and carbon and understand the connection between cutting trees down and carbon, it's a renewable resource. And the southern pine swath is prolific and grows fast. So for Walmart, that was a huge part of it, attracting 15,000 associates back to a new campus. The old campus was a dump. They'll be the first to admit it. It's not just me. And doing it in a really fast and sustainable manner and using local resources and creating a factory. Ultimately, it was a little ambitious. We had to convert back some of the material to steel, give the factory time to catch up, and then convert back to timber. And the final Office 8 was 300,000 square feet, 4-story office building that was erected in 60 days. A few more than 6 because we had to chop, but 300,000 square feet in 60 days is an accomplishment. And it met the client's expectations, and it met the finance expectations. It met insurance. We de-risked it from insurance because you build it so fast. These buildings are at risk when they're under construction. So the faster you build, the more risk you're pulling out of it. And we'll talk about insurance a little later.
So I think it's interesting to observe from Emily and your point that you're talking about large-scale clients, owners, operators, developers in a way because they're doing their own buildings, with custom buildings and complete control on some level of their supply chain because they stood them up. So that's a model that's not available to all. But I think it's also worth noting that that supply chain being built up by leading corporations and being ordered by institutions for dormitories, for example, around the country, has built in the last 5 years a much larger platform for development, which we'll get into. So if we try to expand that, Emily, and say, okay, you're not a major institution, you're not a major, top 6 tech company, but you have Juno. So how does Juno think about delivering the mass timber product to the average 6, 7-story developer on a residential scale in any city in the country?
A lot there. I'm gonna start by piggybacking off something that Carrie said about speed and the fact that the Juno building, the one that we built in Austin, went up. It was 5 weeks, 1 week per floor, 5 people, 4 men and a woman, empty dumpster the whole time. There was no waste from that project. It was really, really, really incredible. And I think one of the most important things that we all need to keep in mind, and one of the big reasons that we're all here is I truly believe that we are going to have to learn, given where the world is going, we're going to have to learn to build with fewer people on site. And in order to build with fewer people on site, we need to think really differently about how we design and deliver buildings. And this now, Erin, gets back to your question about the Juno model. One of my big takeaways from Katerra was that just because you build it, meaning the factory, does not mean that they will come. Katerra invested heavily in large factories that could supply their projects, and then ultimately didn't have the project pipeline to fill those factories and make that business profitable. So one of the things that attracted me to Juno originally when I joined the company a couple of years ago was the OEM supply chain model. Juno's idea was for a prefabricated kit of parts that were pre-designed, but that could be procured from a network of pre-existing suppliers. There's actually plenty of supply capacity in this country for mass timber, but for I guess less for mass timber. I think it's a less mature market than most of the conventional building materials. But the idea was that you should never be single sourced. You should be able to think about where you're building your building and procure the materials that you need to assemble the building from local suppliers that could manufacture to spec, right? This is the same way that the automotive industry builds, right? They have tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers that deliver their components for on-site assembly. So I think moving more toward that model is part of how you learn, how you deliver the ability to build with fewer people on site.
Carrie, can you talk for a second about what makes this as a building product so unique from the biophilic qualities in your own research into the healthy built environment?
Yeah, so one of my passion areas is how the places we live can either make us sick or make us better. And I think I know there's a lot of fantastic research out there that hasn't really been taught in architecture schools, certainly not in real estate in my experience. Everything, and I'm going on a tangent here because I love this topic, but everything from the flooring we have to the paint on the walls to the manufactured wood, a lot of that can be very harmful for our health. One of the ways that the places we live in can be beneficial to our health is mass timber. And a concept called biophilia. I don't know, do any of you know that? You're nodding. It's a kind of zany at first glance, but it makes sense. Humans are attracted to nature. We love being in nature. And so when you have a mass timber building, you see the natural wood, you see the patterns in the grain. This wall, for example, you can tell it's veneer. You don't have that same attraction to it. Troy Harris, who's our MD on timber, he and I were kind of talking before this panel, and he was like, do you notice that when you go to a furniture store, you kind of touch all the wood? You want to feel it. You have this affinity towards it. And I was like, oh yeah, that's true. And that's what happens. And the reason why is when your eyes see a natural pattern, it's called a fractal. It's a natural pattern in nature. So it's similar to a leaf or trees, and they're branching out. And same with the wood grain. And it actually physically calms your body and your stress levels go down. So when a big part of 619 Ponce, and Pete, you alluded to this, is the storytelling. And you go to these tenants, potential tenants, and you talk about this, and you talk about your employees will actually feel better in this space. And that's part of what you get out of it. Another piece outside of the eyesight is the smell. The space smells like a forest. You smell the pine or whatever the tree you've chosen. For us, it was yellow pine. And so I like this story a lot. When people walk into Pottery Barn at our building, they say, oh, what's that candle? It smells so good. And the shop person is like, no, it's the mass timber. And then they tell this whole story of how we did this farm to table concept of taking our timber in Georgia and then bringing it to this building. And it's a really cool moment to share with the random person shopping in the store. So those are just some of the elements of biophilia that I find really interesting.
One of the veins of this that goes deeper than we have time for today is that the ability for mass timber, which is exactly a mass with a very tight thermal envelope, to then skip a performance level and get to passive house, which if you're in New York, local law 97 is coming, means you're going to have a net zero building at the end of the day, is very small. So the cost burden from traditional building to then get to passive house is much larger for a variety of reasons. So what happened in our experience that was so phenomenal is the first mass timber passive house building we built, a client walks in after we'd only had a day or so really sealing the building and talked about how it tasted. So for an architect, like we're trying to open up everybody's sensations all the time in space. I never thought about how a building tasted, but the air, that was how they described the air to us, which I just thought was very special. Knowing we can only get into some of this, Pete, could you talk about your experiences looking at the supply chain in North America, where we've gotten? So really focused on where we are now for the people in the audience trying to understand it versus Europe.
Yeah, so we're catching up. As Aaron mentioned earlier in the graph, we're about a decade behind them, but that puts us at the beginning of the steep part of that curve, which is what we've been hoping for many years. We have now an increasingly robust and sophisticated supply chain in both Canada and across the US, including use of southern pine in the south, 2 factories, several in the northwest using more SPF and for large species. So we're using all 3 of the prolific North American softwood species, which is great because it gives us a much broader design palette for the designers to work with, and they're fast-growing trees and it's softwood, so it's easy to work with. We have had some spectacular flameouts in these factories. They're not easy to run. Turns out gluing boards together is quite a bit more complex than we thought. But we're catching up. The designers are catching up, which is easing the burden of the design assist on the factory. So there's always an integrative process with the factory. So as design improves, because these buildings have to be fundamentally designed for the system, really, really important point, designed and engineered for the opportunities and limitations of the system, so that you're utilizing the most efficient output from the factory and not wasting any product. As you've heard on projects, waste is essentially zero. So we're catching up. It's really important to have a design, build, delivery model and find the right team early and utilize the people with experience so that the factory can do what they do best, which is glue and fabricate and ship, and and we do the rest. So we're getting there, but it really, and touching on insurance, the insurance companies really want to know that the team doing this project has experience and has that book of lessons learned, because that's how they pull the risk out of the job. So knowing the process, knowing the team, and understanding the design, really fundamental.
I'd like to go to Q&A, but Emily, you and I have had 45-minute dialogues on insurance alone, so maybe you'd like to set that up for the audience, then we'll go to questions.
Look, Pete, insurance is not entirely my topic. I will say that if we're talking about fire and we're talking about insurance for mass timber, we're having the wrong conversation. Because actually what we need to be thinking about for mass timber when it comes to insurance is water, right? Mass timber is much, as Carrie pointed out, the Google burn tests, the ability for mass timber to withstand fire is relatively well proven. The fire departments are slowly but surely catching up. I think thinking about having a robust water mitigation plan, because often when there is fire, then the next thing that you do is you flood the building. Mass timber is very susceptible to water damage. That's true in construction and how you're thinking about mitigating weather as your building is going up before it's closed in, but also true in a fire event. And so, having a really good plan, lots of sensors to catch leaks, and having a plan for being able to go to the insurance companies proactively for how you're going to handle it if there is a fire and you're less, and yes, the building burns, but you're also thinking about what happens then.
That's perfect, because I think it frames what everybody on the panel has really worked at, which is how to present mass timber as a building product for its ROI and how to manage your risks along the way to construction. We'd be happy to use the last few minutes we have on questions.
Thanks, Aaron. So a couple questions on the financing side. Are there any differences in terms of what you would get from a construction lender in terms of loan costs or the recourse obligations on a mass timber project? And secondly, has the CMBS market securitized the mass timber project up to now?
I don't know about the latter, but this is a huge topic, but I'll try to distill it down. You have to take a really proactive approach with your lenders. And I'm not a finance guy, so, but I learned a lot by working with ownership and how they're financing these. Once we flatten the learning curve with the lenders and they understand what they're getting into, I didn't see much premium attached to interest rates. They were attracted to the speed of build and how we de-risk that part of the process, and the quicker return on investment, so tenants can get into a building faster, and the leasing velocity has been proven to be very high. I still am tentative endorsing a premium on the pro forma for the lease rate, because that's just not my deal. But we're seeing the leasing velocity increase the competitiveness of the premiums for the space, and therefore they're getting those premiums. But I haven't encouraged that. So on the insurance side is a different story, but on the finance side, it's been pretty conventional. It's not everybody's cup of tea. You have to find the right group.
On the insurance side, Emily really phrased it well. It's education. It's also note it's prefabrication, so you need to approach your insurance partners 10 to 14 months before you expect to start construction, not 2 to 3. Because what you're really doing is lining up and checking all of your conflicts a year ahead of construction, and then you're still saving time on the project because of the amount you reduce on the back end. So it's when we've talked about it, it's really about not a change in the capital stack, but it's where it's allocated on a time scale that really shifts when you do a building like this.
I'll jump in here and say that I think, you know, to answer your question specifically about financing, one of the things that we found really frustrating is that when you go to a lender with a pro forma that looks a little bit different, you get a lot of pushback because, you know, they start saying, well, you're underwriting rent premiums, or your construction schedule is 18 months instead of 22. Conventionally, this would take 22 months. Conventionally, these rents, and so it's really hard to go and get the credit for doing something differently. Instead, what you often get is a risk, is sort of a risk premium slapped on top of you. And so what I would really like to see is more data coming to market that the underwriters can use to help validate the assumptions that we're making in our pro forma, which is part of what makes, you know, part of what makes a product like mass timber work. You really have to get in there and say, okay, this is what's going to be different about the rent, what you can charge, about how it leases, the time to market. This is what's going to be different about construction. This is what's going to be different about your construction costs, because it's not just the structural cost. It's how delivering a mass timber building is really, and any prefabricated building, is different than delivering a conventional building, and all of the trades are impacted. I think the biggest opportunity for helping more of these buildings come to market, this is not the question that you asked, but I'm going to answer it anyway, is in how we think about pre-con, right? In conceptual stage estimating, typically this per square foot of this is what it costs to build the building next door, so this is what it's going to cost to build your building, that's not the right answer for mass timber. You have to think a lot about, okay, so the structure is going to go up like this, how are we going to, what else touches the structure? How are we going to route MEPs? There's a lot of planning that goes into that. What does that mean for our finishes, for drywall, for acoustics, for, any number of other elements? How many times on this project do we have to pull the dumpster? What are our general conditions and requirements? If we're going to build it this much faster, we can take some of those back out of the budget. And so the estimating has to be done differently, and then you have to take it to a lender who gives you the credit for the fact that your numbers look different than a conventional project and believes you. We had somebody on our Santa Rosa project recently looked at us and said, Emily, I can't get this to pencil. And we were trying to get a low value on some land to help in a negotiation. He said, I can't get this to pencil even if land's at 0. And I said, well, what are your assumptions? And he said, well, I took market rate. I took market rate rents, and I, took average construction costs, and I added 15% because it's mass timber. Well, of course not. Thanks, guys. So it's just a more involved process.
To follow up on that question for you two, the material outlays, the financing of early procurement items, financing of design assist that might raise your soft costs, those things don't look traditional.
They don't.
And have often, somebody raises a flag and goes, well, we're not allocating early procurement. When Pete can speak speak to the lead times, but they're longer than going and buying steel. How have you guys successfully had that conversation, informed clients of the owners, partners of that relationship?
We self-developed our first building. That's not a scalable answer. And so as we reboot Juno, which we're in this really interesting moment where we recently bought the assets of the company and are thinking about, you know, how to start over and how to take it to market at scale. We're building our entire business around, we have this really interesting and really unique kit of parts, but it doesn't matter if there's not an easy path to market. And so we're spending all of our time right now thinking about how do we help developers make more money building housing that ideally has a prefabricated element or a mass timber element, because that's what we believe is the future. And what we've realized is that we're gonna have to help people get there. So we're working as an owner's rep on several projects and saying, this is how you have to, these are all the things you do differently. You bring your partners on board early, you pull down some of your capital early, you invest more in the design side, and the results are, you know, that you get the savings down the road in speed and contingency and time to market. But it's hard, right? And it's like hand-to-hand combat with every partner on every project.
So I think we're out of time. I want to thank the panel. Really appreciate you all being here today.